Hello, everyone. My name is Ted Howell. I'm a professor at Rowan University, where I teach both writing and sustainability studies. And today I'm going to be talking with you about how climate change is going to make our air quality worse. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be looking at, I'm going to talk about climate change both globally and specifically here in New Jersey. We'll talk about air quality, some of the science behind it, and the impacts. And that's where we'll really get into how climate change is going to make those health impacts worse. And then I'll very briefly give you a case study of Camden, New Jersey to talk about and illustrate what this will look like. So first I'm going to go over some of the basics of climate change. This will be very quick. I want you to briefly note as I go here that if you'll look towards the bottom left of the screen, you'll notice the sources that I've used for all of these facts and figures that I'll be presenting with you. So as you've probably seen, if you know anything about climate change, it has increased since the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. And we see this on whatever sort of model we're using to track the global temperature. We have 6 different models here, all of which demonstrate the temperature measurements increasing over the last 150 years or so. Specifically, if we look at New Jersey, we have an outlook where it will continue to rise over the next decades, heading towards 2100, the end of the 21st century. So this is a specific output of what the future could look like in terms of rising temperatures, specifically in Camden County, New Jersey, near where I am here in Glassboro. And what this means for us is that as temperatures continue to increase, sea levels are going to rise. That's a big thing here in New Jersey. Energy costs will go up, so all of the things that we buy will continue to raise in price as well. And there will be billions of dollars both lost as a result of extreme weather and also spent as an effort to make this hurt a little bit less. So the impacts of climate change are significant. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in addition to them being just globally and obviously impactful, they have very specific and extreme impacts in the Northeast US, where I am here in New Jersey. So we're going to get more hurricanes and flooding here, more and hotter heat waves. And this is going to cause a lot of stress to the infrastructure here in this part of the country, which is already under quite a bit of stress because it is often quite old, having been built decades ago, and therefore is a little bit less equipped to handle this increases in hotter weather and flooding that come with these hotter and hotter days or there's both more of them and they're hotter when they do occur. New Jersey specifically, surprisingly to many people, is warming faster than most of the rest of the country. So across the country, you'll see about 2.5 degrees, that's Fahrenheit, 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit of warming since 1970. But if we look at New Jersey, it's 3.5 degrees. So the state of New Jersey, in part because of the fact that it is so industrialized and so populated, there are so many people and industries and buildings packed into the state of New Jersey, we end up with something called the urban heat island effect, where the more concrete and asphalt is in a place, the more it stores heat, the fewer trees there are to absorb all of those pollutants that make our air hotter and less pleasant to breathe. These things are all worse in New Jersey than they are in most places in the United States. So not something many people are aware of when they think of New Jersey, but it is in fact the case that it's one of the country's fastest warming states. So let's talk a little bit about air quality before we talk about the intersection between climate change and air quality, because some of the science of this requires a little bit of background knowledge. So air quality comes from pollutants primarily. There are natural sources of what we call particulate matter, some types of pollutants that will really impact the air that we breathe. Some of that comes from lightning and volcanoes and wildfires, which are often exacerbated and caused by climate change and warming. But the majority of what we're going to be talking about today is stuff that comes from stationary and mobile sources, which are things like industry, power plants, sewage treatment plants, cities that are just emitting lots of pollutants, as well as cars, planes, trucks, buses, all of those things that we use that burn fossil fuels to get us around. So this is where most of our pollutants come from. So let's talk a little bit about air quality and how we measure it. So if you'll see here on this blown up illustration here, if we think about beach sand, right, that's something we're all familiar with, it's usually about 90 microns in diameter. But when scientists talk about air quality, they talk about this on a much smaller level, 2.5 microns. Okay, so if a human hair is between 50 and 70 microns in diameter, these particles that we're talking about that are the most hazardous to human health are often in that 2.5. So they're tiny, 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 microscopic pieces of matter that we are breathing in and absorbing. So these ones are the greatest health threat. You will often see things about dust and pollen and mold, which are usually a bit larger in that 10 micron diameter area, but PM 2.5, these tiny little things that come from combustion and the burning of fossil fuels, these are the ones that are most hazardous to our health. So that's usually what researchers will talk about when they are discussing air quality. And the main reason for that is that when we inhale these particles, they're absorbed into our bloodstream and therefore linked to a lot of major health issues, which include things like stroke, heart disease, lung disease, cancer, as well as all kinds of respiratory issues. Now, right here, right now, as I'm recording this in April of 2025, the air quality is good where I am in Glassboro, New Jersey. So you can go online and check this yourself now. Look up the air quality. This is from a website called Air Now. There are several other really good air quality tracking websites that you can look up that have a little dashboard that will tell you both the level of particulate matter as well as how much ozone is in the air at that particular point in time. So right now, not so bad, but it's a sunny spring day here in Glassboro. Unfortunately, that's not the case everywhere, and the impacts are pretty significant. So the impact of air quality on human health is quite severe. This is a graph from The Lancet, which is one of the world's premier medical publications, and it ranks total pollution as the most significant impact on human health globally. And you'll see that it is even more so than smoking and secondhand smoking, which are themselves really significant causes of human mortality. So way more so than these commonly seen forms of death is air quality and the pollution that we're absorbing through our lungs. So let's talk a little bit about ozone. I mentioned this. So a lot of times when people think about ozone, they think about something in the stratosphere, right? Something way above the Earth's surface. That's what we call the good ozone. That's miles and miles above the Earth's surface. That protects us from the sun's radiation. We want that to be there. If that starts to disintegrate, we do things like pass regulations and laws to make sure that it doesn't. However, ozone, when it's down on the ground, is what we call the bad ozone. A lot of times this comes from vehicle exhaust, but it can also come from industrial processes. It's basically tiny little particles that interact with the sun's light and therefore form these very harmful particulate matter that is in our atmosphere, that we're in the air that we're breathing. So a lot of times you will see this talked about in the summer because as there is more heat and more sunlight, more UV light, the ozone increases. There's more of it in the air that we breathe, and therefore it's more hazardous to our health. And this has a lot of impact, right? Both these fine particles and this ozone, these are two forms of pollution that cause a lot of significant problems to people's well-being, including their respiratory system. So this is a really nice graph from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that demonstrates the impacts of both of these things on human health, and specifically particular chronic conditions, which are grouped under the category of COPD, which stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, more commonly thought of as emphysema or bronchitis when it's in its chronic form. And this most thoroughly impacts children and the elderly, both because children it often impacts because they are outside more and have less control over the movement of their bodies and where they decide to go, but also because of their developing lungs. And the elderly, it impacts as a result of aging. So you do see ways that it both causes difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, problems with respiratory health in general, but then also exacerbates people who have pre-existing conditions. Okay, so I've got a really complicated graph for you here that demonstrates that not only does air quality have a big impact on children and the elderly, but it is also disproportionately impactful on Black and Hispanic folks. So this is a very complicated figure from a research study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that found that it was looking specifically at this PM 2.5 exposure that is caused by all kinds of industrial and transportation sources, found that the exposure to these harmful particulates is disproportionately caused by non-Hispanic white folks, but disproportionately inhaled by Black and Hispanic minorities. So this study found that non-Hispanic whites experience what they call a pollution advantage, where they have about 17% less air pollution exposure than is caused by the things that they consume and the way that they produce air pollution, whereas Blacks and Hispanics bear a pollution burden of 56 and 63% of excess exposure. So they are causing less of this air pollution, but suffering from it more. So this air quality is also a justice issue where folks who cause more of it are not being impacted, but folks who cause less of it are being impacted. So this has very significant implications, not just for these scientific facts about air quality, but also for the quality of the life that we live. So now let's talk about the relationship between air quality and climate change. And this is where we really get into the meat of the matter. So there's 4 ways that climate change is going to make our air quality worse. One is that there will be more of those ozone particles that I told you about earlier. There will also be more particulate matter from both drought and floods. So drought causes things to be dry, and therefore there's more dust blowing around, as well as more wildfires, which is number 3. But floods can also cause more particulate matter. If things become waterlogged and form mold, it can really decrease the quality of the air in those regions. And it will also cause more pollen and other allergens to circulate in our air as the weather warms up. So let's take a look at what that's going to be. So this is from a study that was the 5th National Climate Assessment that looked at this specific issue of how is climate change going to make our air quality worse. And they found that it's going to really change the concentrations of these 2 air pollutants here in the United States, both ozone and those PM 2.5 particles. And there's a couple different processes that will cause that. So as you see here on the graph, we have an increase in wildfires, which will degrade our air quality. Heat waves can increase pollution. Just overall temperature increase will make pollution worse. Drought, and then emissions that also come from more things even in our vegetation. So there's one good sign on here, which is that if it rains more, if we see that, that may wash away some of these particles that we're breathing. But on the main, we have a negative impact between climate change and air quality. So there's a lot of research been done into this. It's a lot of really impressive forecasts that demonstrate as a result of a warming climate, we will have more of these particulates and more of this ozone in the air that we breathe. Unfortunately, that will also be more pollen. So this is a forecast of how talking about both observed change, things that have already happened in the recent past, as well as projections into the future, thinking about how much more pollen and ragweed specifically they expect to see in the near future. So not only are we going to be inhaling more of that industrial pollutants that come from ozone and PM 2.5, but we're also going to get more pollen, which will be more exacerbating for folks with allergies. All right, so let's look at a little case study, which is Camden, New Jersey. And this, I think, really illustrates some of the significance of this particular issue. So unfortunately, and this won't surprise you if you're familiar with the city of Camden, but the air quality there is quite poor. This is a report card from the American Lung Association that gave Camden a failing grade, both in terms of ozone and particle pollution. It has gotten better over the past 20 or 30 years. That's what you see there in the graph on the bottom right, but it is unfortunately still quite poor, mostly as a result of waste to energy burning, as well as just a heavy, heavy industrial presence there in the city. Also, you'll see on the left that this does impact both children under 18 as well as adults 65 and older. So that's our two populations that are most susceptible to poor air quality. And there's a significant rise in asthma as well as COPD, those respiratory illnesses that are chronic that we talked about in a previous slide. And it also has a significant impact on people of color here in Camden. So let's look at this in the whole metro area of Philadelphia, Camden, and Wilmington. This is from 6 ABC News, who did a really excellent study of the air quality in Camden. I would strongly encourage you to check out the additional resources that come with this presentation to see a video that really demonstrates exactly what this looks like on the ground for the folks in Camden. But if you look at this slide, you will notice that there is a tiny little dot right there in the middle, and that is the area of Waterfront South in Camden, which has the highest respiratory risk of anywhere in the state of New Jersey. Now, this also profoundly impacts Black and Latino residents more than white residents of the area. So it aligns with those larger trends that I showed you earlier. The bad news further is that as temperature increases, this is a forecast of how many days per year we can expect in the county of Camden to have higher temperatures. And this is a forecast that looks specifically at how many days per year will we reach very high temperatures in which the air quality is significantly worse, both from ozone and from particulate matter. Now, if we look at 30 years ago, we have maybe 29 days where we get a health caution between 90 and 100 degrees, and 7 where it's above 100. This past year of 2024, we had 38 days of a health caution and 15 where the heat was dangerous. And then if we forecast further into the future, 30 years from now, we have an even more significant increase of 44 days and 26 days where the temperature is both caution and dangerous. With that comes much longer heat waves, so you'll see the likelihood of a 3+ day heat wave where the temperature meets that criteria continuing to increase, both 30 years to this year and then 30 years into the future. So the city of Camden really demonstrates the nexus of all of these issues, both how air quality impacts the poorest and people of color more severely, as well as the fact that warming, as the state of New Jersey gets warmer faster than the rest of the country, will make the air quality worse as a result of climate change. So, with all this, you may be thinking to yourself, well, what can we do? What can we do about this? And there are two solutions that I have. I mean, there's many, many solutions, but let's look at a couple different things. So this is from the Fifth National Climate Assessment. It talks about different ways that we can achieve better air quality and have benefit on the climate at the same time. It's a really excellent graph that I would strongly encourage you to check out. So it talks about different regulations and things we can pass through the passing different laws and changing behavior, switching from coal and then to fossil gas. Even that is better. Switching to more plant-based diets, being more energy efficient, switching to electric vehicles. So a lot of the things that we do to improve our chances of having a more sustainable future and preventing the worst impacts of climate change also have an intersection with things that will protect our air quality. So changes that we make to our culture and our industry and our political scene have these positive impacts. So the good news is, in the same way that there is a connection between climate change making air quality worse, we also find a connection between the things that we do to make climate change less severe also have the similar impact of making increases in poor air quality not as impactful. So we have a synergy here and a chance to make our world better in the near future. So those are some of the big overall things, right? Like these are huge, massive undertakings that we need to really take as a whole group of people, not just individually. But I wanted to close today just by sharing one thing that I think you individually can do now that you've made it into this point of the presentation. So I'm going to show you a graph here which talks about the number of adults in the country who are worried about global warming. A lot of times we see in the news very little mention of global warming. We don't talk about it or hear about it much. But people are worried. This is 63% of Americans are concerned about how global warming is going to impact their lives. So there's a large portion, that's almost 2/3 of people in our country worried about this. However, if I click to my next slide, only 36% of people are even occasionally discussing this with their family and friends. So one thing that you can do to make an impact on climate change is just to talk about it. Share what you've learned today. Go to the resources page that accompanies this video. Learn a little bit more. Maybe share what you've learned with some of your friends and family. Just start this conversation because there's a really significant gap. People are very concerned about climate change, and yet they're not talking about it. And that's one thing that you can do to make a difference today. So thanks for watching. I wanted to end by strongly encouraging you to check out the resources that come along with this video, as well as the recordings that are made by some of my wonderful colleagues talking about other issues related to climate change and its impacts. And what you'll find if you go online and want to dig deeper into this is quite a few really wonderful sources. There's a lot of really excellent quality work being done on this topic by folks who are out there trying to understand how to make the air that we breathe cleaner and prevent some of the worst impacts of climate change. So I hope that you will take this with you and, as I said, share what you've learned. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Thank you.